With me now on the program, the Energy and Environment Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Can this happen again today? Because we've got another scorcher in Adelaide today.
Well, they are in the danger zone in South Australia because we are seeing very hot temperatures which are increasing demand. But the bottom line here is that Labor's incompetence has subject South Australians to third world conditions. This should not occur, and this is not the first time it has occurred. In September last year, Kieran, 1.7 million households lost power. That's the first time in Australia a whole state has gone into the black. People trapped in elevators. There was gridlock on the streets.
And last night, 40,000 homes, and the temperatures were over 40 degrees.
Correct, but after
How did it happen?
September, you had December and another outage. Then you had another one in January, and now you've got one in February. What happened here was that demand was very high, but supply was not able to meet demand, particularly because of the low wind conditions. See, wind power, which can provide more than 40 and sometimes 50% and even up to 80% of South Australia's power at any one time, was only yesterday providing 2.5% of South Australian power.
So that was the cause, the low wind power into the system.
There were a combination of factors. There were some problems with some generators. Demand was extremely high. But at the heart of this problem is the fact that South Australia has the highest reliance in the world, on a per capita basis on intermittent sources of power, namely wind and solar. Now, that is a big experiment, in the words of Jay Weatherill. He now has to look into the eyes of the South Australian people and say his big experiment failed. He has to fix it. He has to get more baseload power, whether it's coal, whether it's gas, into the system to stabilise it. Because South Australian businesses and households can't afford to see a repeat of this every month.
It's the biggest reserve of uranium in the world as well. Why not nuclear?
Well, they're having that debate, but that's a long way off. What we need to do is to fix the system.
Coal would be as well, wouldn't it? Unless you get it through the interconnector. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, Kieran. They had a coal-fired power station in South Australia with more than 500 megawatts at Northern, which closed last May. Now, the reason why
it should reopen.
Well, this is an issue that I'm calling on Jay Weatherill today to say is a priority for him to investigate, because coal-based power generation provides a stable system. It's synchronous generation. It's like hydro in Tasmania or gas in other parts of the country. And that's why South Australia has been left so vulnerable.
So you're saying pretty clearly that Weatherill needs to reopen that northern facility, that coal facility?
Well, if I was the Premier of South Australia, I'd be fronting up to my people in that state and saying we will do everything to keep the lights on.
He's saying that there was another facility, a gas one at Pelican Point, not far from the city, which had excess power ready to go into the system. Why was that not utilised? Why did the energy regulator simply shut down the power supply to 40,000 instead of using that gas facility?
Well, that version of events is actually being disputed by the regulator itself. There was an expectation that Pelican Point would come online as prices rose and as demand needed to be met. It didn't happen, and there will be an investigation. But that's the demand side of the equation, which was the high temperatures. The supply side of the equation was largely because of this wind capacity that wasn't available because of the low wind conditions.
This gas capacity was, according to Koutsantonis, the South Australian Treasurer, and according to Premier Weatherill.
And as I said, the market operator has a different version of events. There's going to be a full investigation. No doubt this will be the subject of many discussions between the parties. But the key point here is that wind power, which last June, July provided 80% of South Australia's capacity, only provided, during this heat wave, 2.5% of South Australia's needs. You see, South Australia had yesterday about a 3,000 megawatt demand. Wind at its full capacity in South Australia provides 1,600 megawatts, more than 50%. But yesterday it only provided 2.5%, and that was one of the big problems.
So the government's pointing the finger at the regulator. The
South Australian government.
The South Australian government is. The regulator says he's disputing that version of events. Either way, you've got South Australians in temperatures of upwards of 40 degrees in Australia, one of the richest countries in the world, facing essentially a third world situation of having their power out on a day of 40 plus degree temperatures.
And our hearts go out to those pensioners or the elderly who couldn't access their air conditioner at a time of need, or indeed the young families.
Across the country, isn't it? That we haven't got an energy market which is sufficient to provide energy to all of our citizens.
Well, the reality is, Kieran, that in South Australia, Jay Weatherill, a Labor Premier, said he was conducting a big experiment. They invited in this high uptake of renewables, the highest on a per capita basis anywhere in the world. Now, this big experiment failed graphically last September when 1.7 million households lost their power. Big businesses, lost their ability to function. And of course, this has raised big questions over future investment, unfortunately, in that state. But today, we've seen another repeat. We saw one in December, we saw one in January, we saw now one in February. Now, this is a real problem.
That coal facility you referred to, the Northern facility, how much of the state's supply could that provide?
Well, that's more than 500 megawatts, and as I said, at a point of high demand yesterday, there was 3,000 megawatts that are needed. So it's very significant. It's bigger than Pelican Point, by the way, in terms of that gas unit.
Would someone be willing to reopen it? Is there a company that is lining up to do it? Because your suggestion of a new generation of clean coal, that hasn't been overwhelming endorsement of that by the industry.
Well, Jay Weatherill has a crisis here. So if I was the Premier, I'd be saying, I need a white knight here, and the state government stands ready to support you. I haven't heard those words from him. That's what we need right now. The problem with energy policy in this country is that the states have run ahead of the game, the Labor states. A 50% renewable target in South Australia, a 50% target in Anastasia Palaszczuk's state of Queensland, a 40% target in Daniel Andrews' state of Victoria, and now Bill Shorten has a 50% target for the country. He wants to repeat this madness across the country. Now, we just heard last night that Western Australia, the Labor opposition, is looking to introduce a 50% renewable target into that state. You know what Einstein said was the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
I want to ask you finally about Malcolm Turnbull's speech yesterday. A number of your colleagues that I spoke to privately last night were very supportive of his approach, and finally that was basically the message. Finally, that the gloves were off from the Prime Minister. Is this the sort of approach, though, that goes well in the lounge rooms of Australia? That aggressive approach, or is it more for the party room?
No, it was a very strong speech, and he was speaking to the people of Australia, not just to the colleagues in the Parliament, because what they heard from the Prime Minister yesterday was an outline of why Bill Shorten is not fit to hold the highest office in the country, because his positions, whether it's on tax or energy policy or other issues, is flip-flopping around with no clear vision for the country. Malcolm Turnbull has that clear vision. He outlined it in a press club speech. He'll prosecute it strongly going forward.
Josh Frydenberg, thanks for your time.
Thank
Quick
you.
break, back in just a moment. Stay with us.